evening, everyone, and welcome to my home. Well, at least it is evening here in Philadelphia. I know some of you are joining me from Prague, where you already have 1 a.m. in the morning. So I appreciate your energy to join me. Wherever you are calling in from, welcome. I know we've been hearing and saying this over and over again that this is really unprecedented times, and it's true. If you would have told me in December when we were planning this meeting for the first time, or planning this event, that I would be hosting some 40 people in my living room and playing for you on my digital piano that's basically for late night quiet score reading with my headphones, I never would have believed you. But I'm happy that we can still salvage this event and I can play this beautiful music for you. Thank you so much to the wonderful colleagues at the Czech Center in New York for keeping this event going. I hope to see you all in person sometime very soon. Through the course of this evening, as I'm speaking about some of my experiences and some of the discoveries I've made along the way, they were really made possible to me less by reading and research and more by the openness and generosity of amazing and inspiring musicians, ethnomusicologists, museum curators, writers, historians, everyone. It's way too many to mention, but there will be a few that you will become acquainted with through the stories as we go along through the evening. I want to play some excerpts for you and talk about the music or the piano music of Leoš Janáček that he was writing in the first decade of the last century, so the 1900s in Brno, and then speak to you a little bit about my own mindset or my own way of balancing these things as a person who is coming to and playing this music for audiences in 2020, and someone who is very appreciative and also cares very deeply for both American musical culture and Czech musical culture as well. So many of the topics that we will be encountering through the course of the evening are things that each in their own way are fathomless and subjective and really warrant an entire discussion on all of them. But I want to offer you as a disclaimer that I won't be going into specific analysis or specific topics, but rather I would like to offer you the type of experience to inspire your imagination and maybe think or hear things that you haven't thought of before as we look over such topics as history, culture, language, music, aesthetics, and really what was the life surrounding Leoš Janáček, and not just the myth about him as a composer or some tradition of his way of being. That being said, after we have gone through all of this wonderful material and heard some music, I will open it up to a Q&A and discussion. So please have some comments or questions. If something wasn't clear, you can write them at the end in the chat, and I will unmute you and speak to you along the way. So as I was thinking about how I wanted to frame this experience or this conversation, I was realizing that probably, especially because I can't see all of you, so I have no idea what your backgrounds are or what you're interested in, that I really needed to offer you a little bit of music history background. So I challenged myself to see if I couldn't give you a 3-minute crash course in music history that will give you some of the topics and vocabulary that we can be on a similar page as we move into the musical side of the evening. For anyone who has had even the slightest brush with classical music, been to a concert, or talked to a musician, probably from this following list of composers, you have heard at least 2, 3, or 4 of them. If I would mention to Bach and let's say Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms, Wagner, Mahler, these are all names that most people are semi-familiar with. And they have one really important thing in common, and that would be they are a German-speaking composers. So can't really say they're German or they're Austrian because depending on which time period, perhaps they were part of Prussia or part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the court in Dresden. But what they had in common was this German aesthetic. Now, it's probably without a doubt that we can say that in the 18th and the 19th centuries, for Western classical music, that this German style was the most influential for codifying what would be what we think of as classical music. There are some musicologists that go so far as to say that instead of what we call as a universal classical music, they would argue is actually a German national style just because of how strong this influence was. So, of course, we're not discounting the other nationalities. If you think about the vocabulary and the forms that we use, most of it is based on the developments of the Italian school in this pre-Baroque, late Renaissance style. Or if we think of French aesthetics and their of figuration and ornamentation, this was instrumental in the philosophy and the aesthetics of music. But we have to say that really the synthesis of putting them together was a Germanic institution in our common practice era, so speaking 18th, 19th century. So the question is, why am I speaking about German music and German style when we're thinking about comparing Czech and American music? And the answer is really twofold. First, we'll speak about Janáček, then we'll speak about my ideas of the American connection and then dive into the music. So Leoš Janáček was born in 1854, which was a pivotal time in Western and Central Europe. If you think of what was happening culturally. So in 1848, there was national uprising around Central and Western Europe, where people were thinking that instead of this dominating Germanic influence, which was the official language for most of these countries, they wanted to build a style that was based on their own language and their own culture and their own gestures and the things that they're used to. So why Janáček was so interesting is he decided to build a language that was based specifically on the speech and spent several decades in the countryside recording these folk songs, recording the speeches into musical language, and then consciously constructing a musical style based on them. So that's the reason why you need to know his point of departure from this Germanic type of style into what he would call his own Czech national style. And the other reason is when I'm comparing what is the foundation or the basic, I would say, thought process or educational process of the American School of Classical Music. Again, still thinking about 19th century and not talking about contemporary 20th century music. So if we think of that at that exact same time, 1850s, as when Janáček was born, the state of the US was in disarray. We were in the middle or ramping up to our Civil War, and there was no dominant culture or ethnic group that could provide some type of strong artistic backing. And this is why for artists and composers and musicians who wanted to be successful, they were traveling to Europe to study and of course bringing back with them this German national style or universal style of classical music. And so my teachers and myself, we were trained in this way of thinking and using the imagination and the traditions, as well as the terminology of German theory and German composition. So this brings us to speaking about, now that I've given you all of this wonderful background information, talking about more interesting and more personal experiences. I want to start the story, my personal story, in 2015, so just 5 years ago, when I was getting ready to start the final year of my doctoral studies, my DMA at Temple University. And I had already spent about 3 years with the focus on Czech music, so mainly focused on Janáček and maybe his direct successors, who were his students, etc. And it was a wonderful time because I was playing a lot and comparing and reading a lot and talking a lot to my teachers and colleagues here in the United States. But I had a really burning question, and I knew that I had to go for a longer period of study. Of course, I had visited the country on a holiday and for a vacation, but not on a research capacity. And the burning question I had was really dealing with the type of imagination and type of tradition that most of the American school is really built upon. So if you think of most of the classical music that we are playing in the US, it's from a different time period, a different culture, a different language, etc. So we have to use an imagination and follow what has been the tradition to find what can be a really common and useful way to approach it. So of course I had approached Janáček this way, but I wanted to compare what the imagination and tradition that had grown up in the US to what people would respond to this interpretation, or respond to what their ideas of perhaps a more direct connection to his style and to his playing. So I, in 2015, went and spent the summer, and the first stop that I made was, of course, in Brno, where Janáček was building and working for most of his compositional career. And the first person that I met was the chair of keyboard studies, or the piano department at JAMU, which is the Janáček Academy of Music and Arts in Brno. And I decided that I wanted to play Janáček's piano sonata, which is the most dramatic one that he had played, and to me had such an interesting story. So I sat down and I played the opening for him, which I will do in 1 second. And the piece is titled on a date, which is October 1st, 1905. And the first movement is called Předtucha, or presentiment, like a feeling of foreboding, something negative is going to happen. And the second movement is called Death, and it is one of these amazing Czech words that has no vowels, just 4 consonants, smrt. So in my mind, I'm responding to this feeling of darkness and maybe a pathetic feeling. I'm thinking of these funeral marches of Beethoven, etc. So I play the opening something like this. And now let me switch my camera to the keyboard. So I played the opening in a very beautiful, expressive way. In my mind, I was channeling the idea of death in this somber type of maybe idealized way of death. And Jan was sitting there like this, listening, and he asked me, "Can you tell me the story? Do you know why this piece was written?" So I said, yes, there was in 1905 in October, there was a sort of a protest between the Czech-speaking residents of Brno and the German-speaking residents. And the Czech-speaking population had been promised that there would be a university built that would teach and have the language of instruction in Czech. So of course, this was a wonderful event. And then eventually the funding was taken away and they weren't having it. So there was a protest and people were asking for the right of education in Czech. And in the course of one of the protests, one of the workers, František Pavlik, was bayoneted and killed. And Janáček, who was at the event, saw it and was so upset. He came home and he wrote this sonata, and it was finished a few months later. So Jan said, yes, this is correct, this is correct. And then without saying another word, he pulled me to the window. And for those of you who have been to Brno or know where JAMU is, it's in a very beautiful, there's a square, and it's just under the castle of Spielberg. And next to it, overlooking this window, is the Besedny Dům, which is now the home of the Brno Philharmonic. But at that time, it was just a community gathering place. And Jan pointed to the steps, and he said, there, just there, that is where František was bayoneted and died with his blood running. And in that moment, there was the switch in my imagination from thinking of the piece as being this sort of poetic feeling of death into this snapshot of reality, and also the snapshot of living through the death. So Janáček saw it, and it was still from 1905 until the independence of the country following World War I, another 13 years before they did have the freedom to speak and study in this Czech language. And this was the first sort of bright light or change in my mind as I was approaching. Most of the time in the German style, we are thinking of development and catharsis and tension and release, all of these things we'll talk about later. But we're also thinking about poetry and art and philosophy and more idealized forms than this really specific reality. And Janáček was famous for writing his operas in prose, the libretto in prose. So this is common everyday speaking that you would hear on the sidewalk or when he was in the pub, or if he's out in the countryside, where he was notating these rhythms and then building onto it. So the idea, if I was trying to play this piece, thinking of it as almost as if I was trying to take what was prose and make it into poetry or a rhyme form, which of course is inherently artificial and doesn't have the same type of direct expression. So now I would like to play for you a more realistic approach to this first movement of Janáček's piano sonata. About a month later, I found myself in Prague, and I was meeting another very important pianist when it comes to the interpretation of Czech music. And his name is Radoslav Kalapio, who is also from Brno and studying at JAMU with some of Janáček's direct students. And I was playing for him not such a dramatic piece, but maybe one of my favorite pieces that Janáček has written. And this is his suite called In the Mists. And it's 4 separate movements without descriptive titles, but each one is very unique and precise when it comes to the type of musical gesture that he's trying to portray. So in my mind, I was thinking of this as a very impressionistic type of piece because there are so many colors, and the keys, it's in 6 and 7 flats, so it's very, very misty and sort of far away. So I played him the suite, and I finished, and he said, "Oh, that's very beautiful, but it doesn't sound like Janáček at all." So I said, "Okay, this is great. I will learn a lot." Again, this was the idea of we have this imagination, but how much of it is based in reality or not. So the 2 things that I want to illustrate in this piece for you, we heard about the realism and this really direct connection to prose and everyday speech or everyday events in the sonata. But in this piece, I want to talk to you about first kind of the way that Janáček was trying to create a new way of organizing or playing his music or constructing his music, and also the influence of folk music instrumentation is on his music, which is very, very specific and hard to imagine until you've heard it for the first time. So as I mentioned earlier, the idea of how the German phrase or normal universal classical music phrase is put together is the idea of presenting something, creating tension, and either developing through a variety of techniques. And then at the end, after you've had this arch, there's a catharsis and then release of the tension at the end. Most of the genres are sort of constructed with this trajectory in mind. But Janáček felt that this was not natural and doesn't happen in nature. So his idea was to create more of a collage type of form. So you would have 2 or 3 or more musical objects that were different in perhaps harmony, texture, dynamics, rhythm, any of these elements. And then instead of walking the listener through them by careful connections, it was rather these very quick type of edits. So the job of the performer then is to allow this type of tectonic structure to exist without softening the changes, which was the biggest change that I had been making, thinking, oh, there's a phrase, I have to somehow connect it to the next. And then this idea of folk music instrumentation. The most interesting instrument in these ensembles is called the cymbalum, and the US equivalent would be the dulcimer probably, though usually they're on a smaller scale. So it's a very unique sounding and very beautiful instrument where there's a sound, some type of sounding body, and then above it the strings are strung fairly lightly and then struck with very small thin wooden hammers. So the sound is delicate and silvery and very, very resonant. And usually because they can't stop or sustain the sound in any manipulative form, they're creating these whirls of gesture to keep the sound lasting as long as possible. And we hear these throughout Janáček's music. But if you're not knowing what the sound is, then usually you're using the whole capacity of the big modern piano to make this beautiful resonant gesture instead of these softer type of cascading gestures. So in the piece that I will play for you just now, throughout the piece, there's this gesture. So I was thinking, oh, this is beautiful, so I'm going to take my time to let it resonate as long as I like. But when you change the imagination and you think of this as just a whirl of small wooden hammers, then there's the transparency or clarity of the sound, which changes it completely. So this is the first movement of In the Mists from 1910. So the final thing that I want to speak to you tonight is about two specific terms or musical terminology that Janáček developed himself. So far we've looked at things that he's taken from the countryside or from speech or folk music. And then there was two terms that he felt he needed to coin to be able to communicate what these new ideas were. And many people at the time who didn't understand were thinking them as being very eccentric. And you can see why he was a little bit misunderstood for many decades of his life and not really finding public approval until his 60s and early 70s. Partly because he needed so many decades to experiment and record these types of new ideas before he began writing in this style. This piece he was already in his 60s when he wrote, and partly just because of the nature of the time. So as we look at his last selection on an overgrown path, these are 10 short movements. Each one is 2 or 3 minutes long, and they all have descriptive titles. And to me, they are the most intimate snapshots of his personal life or his daily life, showing the things that he was hearing around him. And most of them, we know exactly where he got his different motives from, which is very interesting for our specific type of realistic imagination, maybe I can say. The first one, as I've said before, as he's writing down these speeches, he's calling them napievky mluví, which there's not really any English translation for it. Some people have called it tunelets, or a small fraction of melody, and that's what he is writing or trying to describe in this type of gesture. So for example, one of the pieces I'm about to play is about an owl. And so he wrote down what the owl's call sounded like. And that became the first gesture of the phrase. The second thing that he coined the word for was just to be able to show these really rapid type of gestures that are coming from the cymbalom, and he called these czasówka, meaning like little snippets of time. So I want to play the first and the last piece for you for two reasons. The first one is called Our Evenings, and though we don't know for sure, many people reminisce that this was a nostalgic piece that he wrote after his daughter Olga died, and they had been very close. She died when she was 21, and this piece sort of shows this type of reminiscence, but also his really interesting use of counterpoint, as he was writing this for harmonium, which is a small type of domestic organ. And then the last piece is called The Owl Has Not Flown Away, and this is where you will hear the call of the owl, and then what he calls an intimate folk song, though it's a tune that he wrote himself to try to mimic the folk song itself. So you will hear Our Evenings, and then the barn owl not flying away, and then we will finish and open it up to your discussion. for now I will switch the camera back. Oh, perfect. So now I will begin to look at all of your messages. And please start if you have comments, questions, and we can begin. Some type of discussion would be amazing. Aha, so I see the first question is from Miroslav Konvelina, where I can find him or he can unmute himself. Aha.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, but first of all, as a director of the Czech Center in New York, I would like to thank you for doing this program. It's part of our larger program, Janáček in America. We were opening the exhibition like 1 month ago, and we are preparing more discussions and hopefully some other events online or possibly in the future live. I have the obvious questions. There are three best-known Czech composer, Antonín Dvořák, Bedřich Smetana, and Leoš Janáček. And so from your point of view, I would like to ask you, to compare these Czech music giants.
Mm-hmm. They are, of course, each writing very interesting and unique music and have some common threads and some very large sort of obvious differences. I think the thing that binds them together and why maybe they are so loved by audiences is that they were all in their own way trying to create some type of Czech national writing. So if you think of their topics, Smetana is writing about the countryside, and they're using these sort of Czech folk tales and things from history. The biggest difference is probably their time period, because with Smetana, he was born in 1820, and he was actually taking part in this Prague uprising in 1848. And then he had to leave. He was in Sweden for the next decade or so. So even though he was trying to write in this national style, he was earlier at a time when it was still not as supported as when Janáček was doing the same almost 100 years later. And Dvořák is another different story because he was very closely connected with Vienna, working with Brahms, and his publisher was there. So I've heard people here in the US say that they feel he has some type of German accent in his music. And I think maybe you can hear that in more regular phrase structure than definitely what Janáček was trying to write about. But to me, in some ways, Dvořák is so interesting because he was traveling here to the US and he was trying to write using what he felt was American themes and encouraging his students when he was in New York or when he was in the central part of the US, saying, you really need to find what is your American style. And he felt that it had to do with Native American tunes and sort of melodic structure, which unfortunately, when he was here in the US in the 1890s, not much work had been done to categorize and to know what their music was really like. So it's interesting to hear what he wrote as this New World Symphony of what he felt American music could sound like.
And who is your favorite composer?
Well, that's impossible. I feel that Janáček has written the best for solo piano. So then I would have to be biased in this way. But if I'm listening, of course, it depends on the mood. You couldn't pick one over the other, I think.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other questions? So Marek, let's see if I can find you. And you can ask your question about...
All right. So I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about your background, traveling between the US and Europe. And maybe how do you experience the connection between America and the Czech Republic?
Well, I have to start the answer to this question going back to Dvorak, because maybe I have some personal bias to him, because when he was here in the US, he spent famously this winter in Spillville, Iowa, which is where my Bouska ancestors were living at the same time, and they had met and known each other. So as far back as that, already I'm feeling some connection between the two countries. And if you're looking historically, if you're looking at the first president, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, he was married to an American, Charlotte, and I know that they spent some interesting time in the U.S. and connecting with the different Czech immigrant societies in Pittsburgh and Chicago were really important for the development of sort of the First Republic. So I feel that the connection can be really strong and really interesting. And as I'm going back, once or twice a year, I feel it is a interesting connection between the two countries.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Aha, David Carpenter. You have a very good question.
Hey, Katelyn, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So I had a question about form in music. I mean, when you hear a piece, and anyone can hear this, doesn't matter if you can read music or not, there's something you hear like a melody, and then you have something that's different. And then usually the music has to come back to the beginning. Mm-hmm. Music tends to do that. It's hard to get away from that to make it feel complete. And you can hear that in, say, Our Evenings? Mm-hmm. The beginning music comes back at the end. And that's something very mysterious about music. It has to make sense that way. You can't just say it once. It's got to come back. And in that sense, there's an idea is presented, something happens in the middle that creates some tension, and then it has to be resolved. And that, I guess you could call that a German tradition, but I'm wondering that there must have been something that Janáček got from the German tradition. Maybe he got that through Dvorak. I mean, there must have been something about that. I can hear it in the phrase structure. It doesn't sound anything like German music. Mm-hmm. But I still hear that sense of maybe not catharsis, but building up attention and releasing it. But you have to come back to the opening idea. What can you say something about, did he feel any influence from the German tradition?
David, that's a great question, and that's something that more people than myself have argued for a long time. Let's see how I have many thoughts. I'll try to keep it to a few of them. Okay. So first of all, I believe I mentioned earlier that he briefly studied in both Leipzig and Vienna in his early 20s. He was there for a combined almost 4 months before he said that he felt his ideas would not fit into this sort of overall projection of what the German form was asking him to do. So he said, my ideas do not match. I need to sign something else. So I know that he was very consciously trained, but then also consciously discarded what he felt was this type of German projection of form, which is connected but a little bit different than the idea of a three-part or ternary return when you come back to the opening structure. I would say that has been widely utilized by folk cultures, by music before. If we're looking at more ancient music, the idea of coming back, even the idea of a conversation, and then you feel the need to repeat whatever the beginning is. So I would say that idea of the return of the beginning for completion exists outside of the Germanic tradition, although they famously exploited the idea of how far you can go away and then how great it feels to come back. Yeah. So I would definitely say that he uses these principles of presenting something, having something else, and then choosing one of them to come back to. Now, it's a little bit interesting because unfortunately we only heard 2 movements of the cycle. So if you heard, it was clearly the first movement was in the key of C sharp minor, and he's flirting a little bit with E major. And if you heard the last movement that I played, feels very strongly the center in E major, but it ends on this feeling of C sharp minor. So that, I would say, almost breaks your question, because he isn't giving a return at the end of the actual complete cycle.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It does. He's certainly making a different take on it. It's hard to get away from that German tradition, I guess.
It's hard to get away from wanting some stability after going away from it. I think that's a little bit more human nature than just German. We can't blame them for everything.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a good question, David. Okay. And Jan is asking about, this is great, about contemporary. Jan, can you hear me?
Oh, hello. Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Okay, my question is that you often work with the younger generation of Czech composers. Can you tell us or describe what is your experience with Czech composers today?
Absolutely. This is also another great question, because everything about my talk basically ended in 1928 when Janáček died, or the latest piece that I played was from 1914. So already more than 100 years ago. And all of this last century has been a break sort of from tradition, especially if you think of the results to culture of the First and Second World War, and then all of the political upheaval in the decades of the 50s and the 60s. So this was my big question in going back in 2015, even more than Janáček, was seeing if I could find any type of trace of his influence in what people were writing today. And the answer is sort of yes and no. It depends on how much consciously who they were trying to follow. So the wonderful thing about contemporary music now is there's such a plurality of styles that you can be successful or write your own personal way and not being bound to a single tradition, which was something that Janáček was trying to break from. So I think this spirit of looking to your own culture or looking inside what is your honest or true expression is something that's very alive and well in the composers that I worked with. One in particular, I feel sort of carries on this folk legacy, and others have tried to go into more intellectual types of music or more experimental type of music. And in that way, it's almost as if the roles have been reversed, because now the US has been more, I guess, maybe avant-garde when it comes to the developing of experimental traditions in music in the 1960s and 70s. So now, instead of being influenced by Europe, now we're doing a little bit more of the opposite. So it's very interesting for me. There was one young composer who's just 19. I was working with her on a piece, and she was consciously trying to follow some of John Cage's principles, who was really important New York composer of the past generation. So I think the world is much more open now, instead of needing to follow a specific path. But I definitely feel this pioneering spirit of Janáček is definitely alive and well in this current generation. Thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So Stacy from Iowa. This is also very multifaceted question. I can find you in the chat. I will. Yes. Stacy, can you hear me?
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk and your playing. And I'm not a musician, so this question is asked from ignorance. I enjoyed hearing you explain the death of the protester and then death in the music and the swirls that you told us in the music and on the instrument. But I'm wondering why it's important for a musician to try to recover or recreate the sound that a composer might have intended, because I thought that musicians would want to put their own interpretation on the music that they played.
Stacy, this is one of these questions that we're also grappling with all the time. And one of the reasons why I love classical music so much and why I was drawn to it at such an early age is we are asked to follow or balance so many really specific things. So we're looking at some historic document that the composer has written for us, most of the time with incredible specificity. So everything we're told, the timing, the articulation, the dynamics, the meaning, everything is in front of us. So we're supposed to faithfully recreate that as best as we can. So it's a faithful interpretation. But then somehow we have to also put our own spin or our own interpretation on it. And that's that fine line of artistry that warrants this live performing over and over and over again. So yes, being informed that he wanted the sound of a cymbalum or he wanted this feeling of death is very important, because then I'm faithful to what he wanted. But every time I perform it, the actual feeling of it will be slightly different, which comes into my personal interpretation. So the fine line of balancing being honest and authentic to this original document, and also being honest and authentic to my personal feeling or taste, is the sort of oxymoron where we're always grappling with, and it makes it endlessly exciting and interesting for us. And I don't know how much the audience needs to know what we're grappling with, but it's important for our information that we do feel as honest as possible, instead of playing and maybe improvising on something which is a little bit more of a jazz or a different style than classical music specifically. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's extremely helpful. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Mega Speed, this is a very easy answer. How long have I played the piano? I've played the piano for 30 years. And what got me to play the piano was, strangely enough, a German composer. It was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And I heard it on the radio, and something just struck me as this is what life is supposed to be. And I guess the rest is sort of history from there. Aaron, this is a great question. Let me find you. It should be at the top.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Wonderful job. Sorry I muted you guys. I was eating dinner. So, yeah, I wanted to just understand, your perspective in, the late 19th century, folk and organ, and, kind of this formalism that was coming into all the folk-based regions in Eastern Europe, right? They had huge influence, obviously, from Austria, Germany, et cetera, Russia. And to just see how like that tension, existed. And because I do know he studied under, I'll just destroy the name, but Franciszek Szuruski, is that close?
Szuruski, Franciszek.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
Very close. But I made you stumble through it because for all of us who practice our Czech pronunciation, it gives us hope to hear other people. So.
Oh, yeah, right.
So I guess you're asking about the influence of this, because he was, studying and teaching organ for a long time, Janáček, as well as looking at the influence of different styles in folk music. Is that what your question is? Aaron, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry about that. I thought I had you unmuted. Yeah, from a perspective of really almost like a folk historian almost, mm-hmm. Right? So, that's because I'm always fascinated by the anthropology of music, or kind of the nexus of where music and culture and, and kind of a cultural anthropology all kind of connects together. And, that's what fascinated me a lot about Janáček is, and just that region is just how much of that is all.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Great. So I'll answer the organ part first, because that's a simpler, shorter question. I feel his organ study in his first years as a teenager, when he was in Prague studying, was very important for this idea of how the textures and pitches are relating to each other. So you can hear them less well in a piece, for example, as the piano sonata, but definitely you can hear this 4-part chorale style in the simpler ones, like the owl that I was playing, all 4-part chorale style. But I think his idea of counterpoint, even not using it in a traditional way, was incredibly influential. And he was at the keyboard, either organ, harmonium, or piano for the rest of his composing life. So I think that never left his mind, even if we can't directly see it. Now, what I hold is one of these topics that, you know, books are written about, but incredibly interesting, and why I think Janáček differs between the folk thinking of Smetana and Dvořák, is the difference between Bohemian and Moravian folk music and folklore. So Bohemia obviously is a little bit more Western looking, because the seat of the Viennese Empire was there, and it was much more influenced by Germanic trends. And Brno and a lot of Moravia was more agricultural and not as cultivated, I would say. So their folk tradition is stronger. And also they were influenced by Slavic chant and not Gregorian chant. So obviously Gregorian chant is the Western style that we're built on. So basically equal whole tones and semitones. And the Slavic chant is split the minor third different ways. So it's a different type of tuning, which is why sometimes Moravian music has a really interesting flavor of dissonance, because their ears are thinking a little bit differently. And also this rhapsodic type of asymmetric, I don't want to say rubato, but I want to say asymmetry in the rhythm and in the measures. So for example, there are times when Janáček is trying to get as or approximate these rhythms. So one hand will be playing in 5/8, so 5/8 notes, and then the other hand will have to do the same amount of time in 4/8 notes. So it's not necessarily 5 against 4, because we're still keeping the meters intact, but it's trying to balance this type of asymmetry and improvisatory elements that more in Moravian folk music, which was a little bit distinct from Bohemian or Hungarian and some of these other regions, which is incredibly interesting, and not so much has been written about it yet, but I'm hoping that will change in the future. To what extent can Janáček be considered a Moravian versus Czech national or Bohemian? I think that this is a difficult question for someone who is not really living and spending their whole life in Moravia. But in my reading of his writings and his discussions, he often identified as a Moravian composer and not as a Czech composer. And part of that is also thinking politically, because up until 1918, the 10 years before he died, he was still living under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they were thinking of themselves obviously not as the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, but as these two different regions, which were fairly distinct musically and culturally at the time. Another good question. Are there any questions that I missed in the chat or other comments? Well, thank you very much for spending the last hour with me. I really appreciate it, and I hope it's food for thought, and that you'll go out and listen to some wonderful Janáček music on your maybe bedtime stand tonight. Who knows? Great bedtime listening. I'm sure you'll have terrific dreams. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant evening.